July 8, 1945, just after midnight. Salina, Utah. The desert air had finally cooled after another scorching July day. Most of the 2,600 souls in town were asleep. 6-year-old Rodney Rasmussen woke to a sound he'd never heard before. A rhythmic hammering that seemed to come from the east end of Main Street, maybe 300 feet from his house. He sat up in bed, confused. Then he recognized it. Machine gun fire. He climbed out of bed, dressed quickly, and ran to the front porch. His father was already there, staring toward the prisoner of war camp across the street. The guard tower was lit up by muzzle flash, a .30 caliber Browning machine gun sweeping back and forth, pouring fire into the camp below. Screams carried across the distance, men yelling in German, men crying out. The gun kept firing, methodical sweeps, left to right, right to left, tearing through canvas tents like they were paper. Rodney's father grabbed his shoulder, pulled him back inside. Told him to get away from the window, but the boy had already seen enough, seen the flashes, heard the screams, known that something terrible was happening to the German prisoners sleeping in those tents. The firing stopped 15 seconds after it started. 250 rounds fired in 3 trigger pulls, 9 men dead or dying, 20 wounded, the worst massacre at a prisoner of war camp in American history. And it happened 2 months after the war in Europe had ended. Today, welcome to this channel and to an authentic World War II story in which ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. My name is Dr. Franklin J. Carter. I'm 80 years old, a retired military veteran, and I have been telling war stories for many years. If you are ready to journey with me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting, so sit down and follow me to the end. To better understand that moment, we have to go back. Back to how a little town in Utah ended up with 250 German prisoners. How those prisoners, men who'd fought for Hitler in the North African desert, ended up being treated like neighbors instead of enemies. And how one American guard, a 5'5" private from New Orleans who'd never fired a shot in combat, decided to kill as many of them as he could. The story got buried. The newspapers covered it for a few days, then moved on. Bigger stories took over. We dropped atomic bombs on Japan a month later. That's what people remember about summer 1945. Not what happened in Salina, but folks who were there knew, men talked about it. The story got told in small ways, in conversations people had when they needed to make sense of something that made no sense. What happened in Salina that night started long before the shooting. Started with decisions made in Washington about where to put prisoners. Started with a young man from New Orleans who hated Germans and never got his chance to fight them. Started with 250 men who thought the war was over for them. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered on May 8, 1945. Hitler was dead in his bunker. The Wehrmacht had laid down its arms. American boys were starting to come home from France, Belgium, and Germany. Every family in America was celebrating, waiting for their son or husband or brother to walk through the front door. But we still had nearly 400,000 German and Italian prisoners of war scattered across the United States. They'd been captured in North Africa, in Italy, in France, shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty ships that would otherwise return empty, distributed to camps in 46 of the 48 states. Used as farm labor, mostly, because we needed the workers and they needed to be fed, and the Geneva Convention said you had to treat prisoners humanely, which meant giving them work and paying them for it. Utah had about 8,000 prisoners spread across a dozen camps. The big camp was in Ogden, housing nearly 4,000 Germans. Then there were smaller branch camps, temporary setups near farming communities where the harvest needed hands. Camp Salina was one of these branch camps. The camp sat at the eastern end of Main Street in Salina. Right inside the town, you could walk from your house to the prisoner compound in 5 minutes. It used to be a civilian conservation corps camp back in the 30s. The CCC had built camps all over the country during the Depression, putting young men to work on conservation projects. When the war came, a lot of those camps got converted to house prisoners. Camp Salina wasn't big, 43 tents on wooden platforms. A kitchen building where the prisoners cooked their own meals, a mess hall, an officer's quarters for the American guards, 3 guard towers around the perimeter. Double fence of barbed wire. It could hold maybe 250 men comfortably. That's about how many were there in July 1945. The prisoners were Germans, most of them Afrika Korps. They'd been captured in Tunisia in May 1943 when the Axis forces in North Africa finally collapsed. 275,000 men surrendered that month. The biggest haul of prisoners America had taken in the entire war. Some had been shipped to Britain first, then transferred to the United States when Britain ran out of space. Others came straight across the Atlantic. By summer 1945, these men had been prisoners for 2 years. They'd worked on farms across America, picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Kansas, worked in canneries in California. And now, in June 1945, 250 of them had been sent to Salina to help with the sugar beet harvest. Sugar beets were big business in central Utah, labor-intensive crop. You had to thin them by hand in early summer, then harvest them in the fall. With so many American men overseas, farmers were desperate for workers. The government sent prisoner details wherever they were needed. The prisoners worked 6 days a week, got paid 80 cents a day, which went into camp accounts they could spend at the canteen on cigarettes, candy, soap, and writing paper. The men at Camp Salina were waiting. Germany had surrendered in May. The war was over. They figured they'd be going home soon. Just a matter of time until the paperwork got sorted and the ships got arranged, and they could board a transport back to whatever was left of Germany. In the meantime, they tried to make the best of it. Tried to create some semblance of normal life in an abnormal situation. Morning started early, réveillé at 6. The prisoners rose from their cots, washed at the communal facilities, and dressed in their faded uniforms. Breakfast at 7 in the mess hall. Oatmeal, usually, sometimes eggs. Coffee that was weak by German standards but hot and plentiful. The prisoners cooked their own meals. Had their own cooks among them, men who'd worked in German field kitchens during the war. After breakfast, roll call. Every morning the American guards counted them. Made sure nobody had escaped during the night. Not that there was anywhere to go. Salina was surrounded by hundreds of miles of desert and mountains. Even if you got out of the camp, where would you run to, and why? The war was over. Better to wait it out here, getting 3 meals a day, than to die of thirst trying to walk to Mexico or wherever escaped prisoners thought they might find sanctuary. By 8 o'clock, the work trucks arrived. The prisoners climbed into the beds, 20 or 30 men per truck, sat on wooden benches, swaying as the trucks bounced down dirt roads to the beet fields. The farmers who hired them were waiting, showed them which rows needed work. Explained what needed doing, usually through gestures since most farmers spoke no German and most prisoners spoke limited English. The work was hard, bending over beet rows all day under the Utah sun. The prisoners worked in their uniforms, sleeves rolled up, caps on their heads to ward off sunburn. They moved down the rows methodically, thinning plants, pulling weeds. Doing work that was mind-numbing but not complicated. Work that left you exhausted by evening but gave you time to think. Too much time. Time to remember home. Time to wonder what was left of Germany. Time to imagine what you'd find when you finally got back. Lunch was at noon. The farmers usually provided something, sandwiches, cold water. Sometimes they ate with the prisoners, sitting in the shade of a truck, trying to communicate. Some farmers got to know individual prisoners, learned their names, found out where they'd come from, what they'd done before the war. One farmer discovered his prisoner had been a carpenter in Hamburg, started bringing his tools so the German could fix things around the farm during breaks. Another farmer had a prisoner who spoke decent English. They'd talk about crops, about weather patterns, about the differences between farming in Utah and farming in Germany. These interactions were strange, complicated. The farmers knew these men had fought for Hitler, had been enemies. Some of the farmers had sons overseas, boys who'd fought against Germans in France or Belgium. But here, in the beet fields of Utah, politics seemed distant. These were just young men doing work, being polite, doing what they were told. Hard to hate someone when you ate lunch with them every day. The workday ended at 5 or 6, depending on the season and the light. The trucks came back, picked up the prisoners, hauled them back to camp. They arrived dusty, sweaty, and tired, lined up for roll call again. Then they had free time until dinner. This was when the camp came alive. When the prisoners stopped being workers and became themselves again. They played soccer. This was serious business. Teams formed along old unit lines. The 15th Panzer Division against the 21st, the 90th Light against the 164th Infantry. They'd set up goals on a flat area inside the camp perimeter, use whatever they could find for a ball, sometimes a real soccer ball from the Red Cross, sometimes a bundle of rags wrapped tight with twine. The games were competitive, fast, skilled. These men had grown up playing football, which Americans called soccer. They knew the game, took it seriously, played like it mattered, because in a way, it did. It was a connection to home, a piece of German culture, a way to feel like themselves instead of prisoners. American guards sometimes watched, sat on crates or leaned against fence posts, smoking cigarettes, watching these Germans run back and forth chasing a ball. Some guards got interested in the game, started rooting for teams, placing small bets among themselves on outcomes. It was surreal. Enemy and captor, sharing space, finding common ground in a game. After dinner, there was more free time. The prisoners read. The camp library had maybe 100 books in German, novels mostly, some technical manuals, books about history, about engineering, about farming. The Red Cross sent them periodically. Prisoners checked them out, read them on their cots or outside if the weather was nice. Some men read the same book 3 or 4 times, not because they loved it, because there wasn't much else to do. Letters home were a big part of evening time. The prisoners could write once a week. The letters went through American censors who read every word, crossing out anything that seemed like military information or criticism of American treatment. Most prisoners knew this, kept their letters bland, told their families they were healthy, well-fed, working on farms, waiting to come home, avoided saying what they really felt, the loneliness, the uncertainty about what they'd find when they returned. Mail from home was irregular. Sometimes a prisoner would get 3 letters in 1 week, then nothing for 2 months. The letters came through complex routing, from Germany to the International Red Cross in Switzerland, from Switzerland to the Red Cross in Washington, from Washington to the camp. By the time a letter arrived, it might be 3 or 4 months old. News was outdated. Family situations had changed, but still, the letters were precious, connection to home, proof that someone remembered you. Some prisoners never got letters. Their towns had been bombed flat, their families scattered or killed. These men had the hardest time. No way to know what waited for them. No reassurance that anyone would be there when they got back. They formed friendships, tight bonds based on shared experience, men who'd fought together in Africa, surrendered together, survived prison camps together. They looked out for each other, shared cigarettes, shared news, helped each other get through the boredom and isolation. But there were tensions too. Not everyone got along. Some prisoners were hardcore Nazis, true believers who insisted Germany had been betrayed, not defeated, who talked about secret weapons that would turn the tide, who harassed anyone who suggested Hitler had been wrong or that Germany deserved to lose. Other prisoners wanted nothing to do with politics. They'd been soldiers because they'd been drafted, not because they believed in the cause. Now they just wanted to survive. Go home. Start over. They avoided the fanatics, kept their heads down. And then there were the ones who'd changed, who'd spent 2 years in America and started questioning everything they'd been taught. Who'd seen that Americans weren't the weak, decadent enemy propaganda had described, who'd been treated better by their captors than their own army had treated them. These men faced the hardest questions. What did it mean that everything you'd believed turned out to be wrong? The camp had a rhythm, work and meals and recreation and sleep. Week after week, month after month, the prisoners waiting, the guards watching, everyone existing in a strange limbo between war and peace. The townspeople in Salina got used to having Germans around. The prisoners worked on local farms. Farmers said they were good workers, polite, efficient, didn't complain. Some farmers got friendly with them, shared lunches, talked through gestures and broken English about crops and weather. It wasn't a deep friendship, but it wasn't hostility either. Just men getting on with the business of living. People in town saw the prisoners sometimes, saw them being trucked out to the fields in the morning, saw them coming back dusty and tired in the evening. The Germans wore faded Afrika Korps uniforms with the letters PW painted on the back in white paint. Prisoner of war. They looked like what they were, young men mostly, thin from years of short rations, sunburned, tired, not threatening, just tired. Guard duty at a prisoner of war camp was not considered a choice assignment in the American military. The men who ended up there were usually the ones who couldn't be sent to the front lines. Physical problems, discipline issues, psychological troubles. The Army needed guards, but it didn't send its best men to do the job. It sent the men it had left over after the real soldiers got picked for combat duty. Private Clarence Bertucci was one of those leftover men. Bertucci was born in New Orleans on September 14, 1921. Little fellow, 5'5". Weighed maybe 115 pounds soaking wet. Dark-haired, slight build. He dropped out of school in 6th grade. Joined the United States Army in 1940 when he was 19 years old. By July 1945, he'd been in the Army for 5 years. He was still a private. That tells you something right there. A man who can't make it past private in 5 years is a man with problems. Bertucci had problems. His service record showed 2 courts-martial for minor infractions. Missing guard duty, being absent from his post, missing a train. Small things, but they added up. He'd been hospitalized 12 times during his service. Several of those hospitalizations were for psychiatric evaluation. The Army knew he had issues, but they kept him anyway. The war needed men. Even men with problems. The pattern was there if anyone had looked closely. Bertucci couldn't follow orders consistently, couldn't maintain discipline. Something in him resisted authority, resented structure. He'd joined the Army with ideas about glory and combat and proving himself. Instead, he got drudgery, guard duty, manual labor, the kind of service that broke men down instead of building them up. His psychiatric evaluations noted depression, anger issues, difficulty forming relationships with other soldiers, but they didn't find him dangerous, didn't see signs he'd hurt anyone. So he stayed in. Got transferred from one assignment to another when he caused trouble, always ending up somewhere worse than before. In 1944, Bertucci had been sent to England with an artillery unit. Spent 8 months there, never saw combat, never got close to the front lines. By his own account, he felt cheated. He joined the Army expecting to fight Germans. Instead, he sat in England loading shells and maintaining equipment, while other men did the actual fighting. The resentment grew during those months. Watching combat units move through on their way to France, hearing stories from men who'd been in the thick of it, seeing wounded soldiers come back with ribbons and respect, and the knowledge that they'd done something important. While Bertucci loaded shells, pulled guard duty, counted inventory, the kind of work that needed doing but earned no recognition. His comrades remembered him as quiet, kept to himself mostly. But when he drank, which was often enough to raise eyebrows, he talked about Germans, about what he'd do to them if he ever got the chance, about how they deserved to die for starting the war, for killing American boys, for all of it. The other soldiers mostly ignored him. Everybody had opinions about the enemy. Bertucci's were just more intense. During a furlough home to New Orleans in late 1944, Bertucci visited his family on Dryades Street. His mother later told reporters he seemed different, angry in a way she hadn't seen before. He talked about feeling cheated, about how the army had promised him a chance to fight and then stuck him in England doing nothing. She tried to talk to him, asked if he wanted to come home, maybe get a discharge. He refused, said he'd see it through, do his duty even if the army wouldn't let him do it the way he wanted. Before he left, he penciled something on the doorsill of the house. 4 words: live and let live. His family remembered it because it seemed so unlike him. Clarence wasn't a peaceful man, wasn't given to philosophical musings. The message confused them. His mother wondered if maybe he'd changed, maybe found some peace, maybe learned to accept his situation. She was wrong. The message wasn't about peace. Looking back, with the knowledge of what came later, it reads like something else. Like a man trying to convince himself of something he didn't believe. Like someone writing down the person he wished he could be instead of the person he was. Some people later said Bertucci had told others he would get his Germans someday, that he'd get his turn to kill them. These reports were never confirmed. Nobody could remember exactly who he'd said it to or when, but they fit with what people knew about Bertucci. He was angry, he hated Germans, and he'd never gotten his chance to fight them. His mother also told reporters, after the shooting, that she believed his problems started with an appendectomy he'd had in 1940. Said he'd gotten a spinal injection as part of the procedure, and something must have gone wrong. Something must have happened to his brain. It was a mother's explanation. A way to make sense of the senseless. Her son couldn't have done this unless something was medically wrong with him. But the doctors found no evidence of brain damage from any procedure. Bertucci's problems were psychological, not neurological. By early 1945, the Army had apparently decided that Bertucci was more trouble than he was worth in a combat unit. They sent him stateside, assigned him to guard duty, first to one camp, then to another. In June 1945, he ended up at Camp Salina, the end of the earth as far as military assignments went. A tiny camp in a tiny Utah town, watching over Germans who posed no threat to anyone. The assignment must have felt like the final insult. 5 years in the Army, and this is where he ended up, guarding the very enemy he'd wanted to fight, watching them play soccer and laugh and act like the war didn't matter anymore. Watching them wait comfortably for repatriation, while he, an American soldier, had to make sure they had enough to eat and didn't escape, and were treated according to the rules. Bertucci arrived in Salina carrying 5 years of frustration. 5 years of watching other men fight while he loaded guns and stood guard. 5 years of hatred for an enemy he'd never faced. And now here he was, guarding that enemy, seeing Germans every day, men who'd actually fought. Men who'd been in the Afrika Korps, who'd faced British and American soldiers in battle. Men who'd done what Bertucci had always wanted to do. The other guards noticed something off about him. He was quieter than most. Didn't join in when they played cards or joked around. Kept to himself during off hours. When he did talk, it was about Germans. About how they shouldn't be treated so well. About how it wasn't right that enemy soldiers ate better than American civilians back home. About how someone should do something about it. The other guards mostly ignored him. Every camp had a few men who complained. Who didn't like the assignment. Who resented having to treat prisoners decently. It didn't mean anything. Just talk. Venting frustration. Nobody thought Bertucci would actually do anything. The resentment must have eaten at him. Every day, watching these Germans play soccer. Watching them laugh. Watching them eat, sleep, and work. Watching them wait comfortably for the war to end so they could go home. While he, an American soldier, had to stand guard over them, had to make sure they were fed properly, treated properly, and kept safe. It didn't seem right to him. These were the enemy. These were Hitler's soldiers. And yet they were living better than he'd lived during his entire time in the army. On the evening of July 7, 1945, Bertucci went into town. He spent several hours at a bar drinking beer, not enough to get drunk according to witnesses, but enough to loosen him up. Enough to maybe push him past whatever internal barrier had been holding him back. Around 10 o'clock, he left the bar. Stopped at a café on Main Street, had coffee, talked to a waitress, a young woman who worked there, told her something exciting was going to happen that night. She asked what he meant. He just smiled, said she'd hear about it. Then he walked back to camp, reported for guard duty at midnight. The changing of the guard happened on schedule. Bertucci relieved the previous watch, climbing up into one of the 3 guard towers that overlooked the camp. The tower was equipped with a mounted .30 caliber M1917 Browning machine gun, a belt-fed weapon, the kind that could pour out sustained fire for as long as you had ammunition. There was always a belt of ammunition in the tower. 250 rounds, kept loaded and ready in case of emergency, in case of escape attempts or riots or whatever scenario the army had imagined might require machine gun fire into a prisoner camp. Bertucci waited until the previous guard was out of sight, waited until everyone had gone to bed. The American officers slept in their quarters. The German prisoners slept in their tents. It was quiet, just the sound of the desert wind and the occasional dog barking in town. Then Bertucci threaded the ammunition belt into the gun. He aimed low, into the tents. 43 tents arranged in neat rows below him. Each tent held 5 or 6 men sleeping on cots. The tents were canvas. They'd stop nothing. A .30 caliber round would punch straight through and keep going. Bertucci pressed the trigger. The gun roared to life. The sound echoed across Salina. People woke in their beds, confused. What was that? Thunder? Couldn't be. Sky was clear. Then they realized. Gunfire. From the prison camp. Bertucci swept the gun back and forth, left to right to left. Methodical, deliberate. He wasn't panicking, wasn't spraying wildly. He was aiming. Taking his time, making sure he hit as many tents as possible. Inside the tents, men were dying. Some died in their sleep, never knowing what hit them. Others woke to the sound of the gun, had maybe a second to process what was happening, before rounds tore through the canvas and through their bodies. Some tried to run, scrambled out of their cots toward the tent flaps. Got hit anyway. The bullets went through the canvas, through one man, through the tent wall behind him, into the next tent. Otto Bross was 25 years old. Born November 16, 1919, in Pforzheim, Germany, single. He was asleep in his tent when the firing started. A round hit him in the chest, killed him instantly. Ernst Fuchs was 24. Born January 19, 1921 in Kirchberg, he woke to the gunfire, tried to get up, got hit in the abdomen, died within minutes. Gottfried Gog, 29 years old, from Nordrhein-Westfalen. Hit in the head, dead before he could scream. Georg Lieske, 31, married to a woman named Antoni back in Germany. He was awake when the shooting started, tried to warn the others, got hit multiple times, died in the tent. Hans Meyer, 24. Walter Vogel, 32, married to Emma. Adolf Paul, 28. Fritz Stockmann, 24. All dead within the first 15 seconds. Friedrich Ritter was 48 years old, oldest man in the camp. He'd survived years of war in North Africa, survived capture, survived 2 years in American prison camps, got hit in the abdomen, didn't die right away, would linger for 6 more days before his wounds killed him. 20 others were wounded, some seriously. One prisoner was nearly cut in half by the machine gun fire. He'd survived for 6 hours, lying on the hospital lawn because there wasn't room inside for all the wounded. Blood flowed out the front door of the Salina hospital. People who saw it never forgot. The sheer amount of blood. Lieutenant Albert Cornell heard the firing. Came running from the officers' quarters, saw the muzzle flash from the tower, realized what was happening, ran toward the tower, yelling for Bertucci to stop. Bertucci yelled back, "Send up more ammo. I'm not done yet." Cornell ordered him to come down. Bertucci refused. Said some of them were still alive. Had to finish the job. Cornell sent another guard up the tower. The guard climbed up, found Bertucci still gripping the gun. Bertucci had fired all 250 rounds. The belt was empty. He was looking around for more ammunition, demanding they bring him more so he could keep firing. The guard grabbed him, pulled him away from the gun. Bertucci didn't resist much, just kept saying he needed more ammunition. Kept saying he wasn't done. Some of them were still alive. They brought Bertucci down from the tower, put him in custody. He was calm. Didn't try to run, didn't try to fight, just stood there while they handcuffed him. His explanation when they asked why he'd done it was simple. He hated Germans, so he killed Germans. The camp erupted into chaos. American guards ran to the tents, found bodies, found wounded men crying out in German, found men in shock, covered in blood, but not knowing if they were hit or if it was someone else's blood, found torn canvas and shredded cots, and the smell of cordite and blood. They started pulling the wounded out, carrying them on makeshift stretchers, on blankets, on their backs. The Salina hospital was small, 14 beds, a single doctor, 2 nurses. They were overwhelmed within minutes. The doctor, a man who'd treated farming accidents and broken bones and the occasional car crash, suddenly had 20 gunshot victims. He set up triage on the front lawn, sorted the wounded into those who might live and those who wouldn't, worked on the ones he could save. The nurses moved between patients, applying pressure bandages, starting IVs, doing what they could with limited supplies. Blood soaked through their uniforms, soaked into the grass. People walking by the hospital the next morning would see the grass still dark with it. One prisoner had been hit so badly that he was nearly severed in 2. The doctor looked at him, knew there was nothing to be done, gave him morphine, sat with him while he died. Took 6 hours. The man was conscious for some of it, spoke in German. The doctor didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. The man was calling for his mother. 6 prisoners died right away. 2 more died in the Salina hospital over the next hours. Friedrich Ritter would die on July 14th, 6 days after the shooting. 9 total dead, 20 wounded, some of them crippled for life. The American guards kept watch through the night, worried about retaliation, worried the prisoners might riot, might try to get to Bertucci. But there was no retaliation. The prisoners were in shock. Some were crying, some were angry. But they didn't fight, didn't resist. They'd been soldiers long enough to know that chaos only made things worse. Bertucci was taken to Fort Douglas in Salt Lake City, placed under guard at 9th Service Command Headquarters. The Army didn't know what to do with him. He'd committed murder, multiple murders, of prisoners of war, men who were under American protection, men who'd surrendered in good faith, expecting to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. But Bertucci was unrepentant. When they questioned him, he showed no remorse, said he'd do it again if he had the chance. Said he'd been tempted for weeks to turn the gun on the prisoners. Said he was only sorry he hadn't had more ammunition. His service record told part of the story. 2 courts-martial, 12 hospitalizations, multiple psychiatric evaluations. The Army had documentation that Bertucci had problems, had known for years. But they'd kept him in service anyway, kept assigning him to guard duty even though they knew he was unstable. Captain Wayne Owens from the Ogden prisoner of war camp was assigned to investigate. Owens was thorough, interviewed Bertucci multiple times, interviewed the guards, the prisoners, the townspeople, built a case. Concluded that Bertucci was sane, knew exactly what he was doing, should be court-martialed for murder. Owens wrote his report. Recommended Bertucci face trial, sent it up the chain of command. The Army disagreed. Bertucci was evaluated at Bushnell Army Hospital in Brigham City, Utah. Army doctors spent several weeks examining him, concluded he was mentally unbalanced, declared him insane. Owens protested. Pointed out that Bertucci had planned the attack, had told the waitress something exciting would happen, had waited until the guard changed and everyone was asleep. had aimed carefully to hit as many tents as possible. That wasn't the behavior of an insane man. That was premeditation. That was murder. But Owens's superiors overruled him, said Owens had no authority to determine sanity, said the doctor's evaluation was final. Bertucci would not be court-martialed. Instead, he'd be sent to a psychiatric facility. Bertucci was transferred to Mason General Hospital in Brentwood, New York, a facility for mentally ill soldiers. He'd spend years there. How many years exactly is unclear. Records are spotty. But he was eventually released. Spent the rest of his life in and out of institutions. Died on December 2, 1969, in New Orleans. He was 48 years old. The decision not to prosecute Bertucci caused controversy. Some Americans felt he'd done the right thing. Germans were the enemy. They'd started the war. They'd killed millions. If an American soldier wanted to shoot a few, well, that was war. Others were horrified. These weren't enemy combatants. They were prisoners, under American protection. Killing them was murder, no different than if Bertucci had shot American civilians. The Army should have prosecuted him, should have shown the world that America took its obligations seriously. The German dead were buried with full military honors at Fort Douglas Cemetery in Salt Lake City. The ceremony was held on July 12, 1945, 4 days after the shooting. The caskets were draped with American khaki uniforms. No flags. The Nazi flag had been banned, and the new German flag didn't exist yet. So the dead went into the ground without the symbols of their country. Just American military uniforms covering wooden boxes. Wreaths were placed on each casket. Roses, gardenias, carnations. 2 wreaths per casket, paid for by the American military. The cost came out of the prisoner of war budget. We buried them with flowers bought with American money. 15 prisoners from Camp Salina attended. They'd asked permission to be pallbearers. The Army agreed. The prisoners wore their uniforms, cleaned and pressed. They carried the caskets from the chapel to the graves, set them down gently, stood at attention while taps played. A choir from the Ogden camp sang. 17 German prisoners who'd been allowed to travel to Salt Lake City for the ceremony. They sang Song from the Monks. Good Comrade, Down in the Valley. The American guards made sure no Nazi songs were sung, but otherwise they let the prisoners mourn in their own way. Chaplain Frank Edwards, an American, conducted the service in English. A German prisoner translated for the others. Edwards spoke about duty and sacrifice, about men dying far from home, about the tragedy of war. He didn't mention that these men had been murdered, didn't mention Bertucci, just talked about soldiers who'd done their duty and deserved to rest in peace. Friedrich Ritter, the man who'd lived 6 days with his wounds, died on July 14th. A second service was held for him. Same cemetery, same rituals. The choir came back. The prisoners came back. Ritter was buried next to his comrades. The graves are still there. Fort Douglas Cemetery. 21 German soldiers from World War II are buried there. 12 Italians. 1 Japanese. All prisoners who died in American custody. Some from natural causes, some from accidents. 9 from Salina. Each grave has a simple marker, name, rank, date of death. The markers are maintained by the American military. Flags are sometimes placed there on Memorial Day. Not always. Depends on who remembers. The families of the dead weren't notified right away. The American military had a process for notifying next of kin, but it was slow. The International Red Cross was supposed to handle communication with German families. But Germany was in chaos in summer of 1945. Cities bombed to rubble, mail systems destroyed, governments collapsed. Finding the family of Otto Bross in Pforzheim or Ernst Fuchs in Kirchberg was nearly impossible. Some families found out from other prisoners who went home. Men who'd been at Salina, who survived, who were repatriated in 1946 and 1947. They carried lists of the dead, delivered messages to families when they could. Some families didn't find out for years. Just knew their son or husband or father had been captured, had been sent to America. Then nothing. Letters stopped coming. Inquiries went unanswered. They assumed the worst, but didn't know for certain. When German authorities finally got organized enough to respond to inquiries, they sent form letters. Regret to inform you. Died in American custody. Buried at Fort Douglas Cemetery, Salt Lake City, Utah. No details about how, just that he was dead. The families wanted compensation. Under international law, they were entitled to it. But there were legal obstacles. Germany and the United States didn't have a compensation agreement in place. The German government, what was left of it, said it couldn't pay. The American government said it wasn't liable because the deaths occurred due to the criminal actions of one soldier, not official policy. In the end, most families got nothing. A few received small payments years later. Most just knew that their loved one was buried in America, in a place they'd never be able to visit, under a marker they'd never see. The wounded prisoners recovered as best they could. Some healed completely. Others carried injuries for the rest of their lives, missing fingers, damaged organs, chronic pain. When they were healthy enough to travel, they were sent back to Germany. Shipped home with the other prisoners in 1946 and 1947. 2 of them returned to Utah in 1988. Old men by then, in their 60s and 70s. They came for the rededication of the German War Memorial at Fort Douglas Cemetery. It was November 13th, Volkstrauertag, the German National Day of Mourning, second Sunday of November. The day Germans remember their war dead. The German Air Force had funded a refurbishment of the memorial. A statue honoring the deceased prisoners and all victims of despotic governments around the world. Representatives from the German embassy in the United States attended. So did American veterans, local officials, and these 2 old men who'd been at Salina that night in 1945. They walked the cemetery, looked at the graves, stood before the markers of men they'd known. Men they'd eaten with, worked with, played soccer with, men who'd been alive one minute and dead the next because an American guard decided to pull a trigger. One of the survivors gave an interview to a local newspaper. Said he'd never understood why it happened. Said Bertucci had seemed like any other guard. Quiet. Kept to himself. Nothing that would make you think he was planning to kill anyone. Said he'd forgiven him, though. Had to. Carrying hate for 50 years would have eaten him alive. The reporter asked if he'd ever gotten compensation. The old man shook his head. No money. But he got to go home, got to live, got to have children and grandchildren. That was worth more than any payment. Camp Salina closed in December 1945. The prisoners were transferred to other camps. The tents were taken down. The buildings dismantled. The land returned to its original use. For a while, it housed other farm laborers. Then the buildings fell into disrepair. Eventually, they were torn down completely. Today there's a museum, small building. Opened in November 2016, right at the site where the camp used to be. Eastern end of Main Street, same spot. You can visit if you're in Salina. They've got photographs, artifacts. A model showing how the camp was laid out. Written accounts from prisoners and guards. The most striking thing in the museum is a diagram showing how Bertucci fired. The tents marked out on a map. Dotted lines showing the path of the bullets, left to right to left, sweeping back and forth. 30 of the 43 tents hit in 15 seconds. The museum curator, a woman named Joy Bingham, gives tours. She knows everything about what happened, has interviewed survivors. Read all the records. She'll walk you through the 3 original buildings that still stand, show you where the guard tower was, where the tents were, where the hospital treated the wounded on the lawn because there wasn't room inside. She'll tell you about Rodney Rasmussen, the 6-year-old who heard the gunfire. He lived in Salina his whole life, died in the early 2000s. But before he died, he recorded his memories. Described waking to the sound of machine gun fire, seeing the muzzle flash, understanding, even at 6 years old, that something terrible was happening. Joy will tell you about the farmers who employed the prisoners, how most of them were shocked when they heard, how they'd known these Germans by name, had shared meals with them, had come to think of them as just workers, just young men doing a job. Hadn't thought of them as the enemy anymore. She'll tell you how the town reacted. Some folks were angry at Bertucci. Thought he'd brought shame on Salina. Others defended him. Said Germans deserved what they got. The arguments went on for years. Families split over it. Friendships ended, and she'll tell you how it's been forgotten. How most Americans never heard about Salina. How it got buried under bigger news. The atomic bombs, the Japanese surrender, the end of the war. How by the time people might have paid attention, there were other things to think about. Rebuilding, the post-war boom, the Cold War starting up. Salina became a footnote. But it mattered, still matters, because it shows something about who we were, about the contradictions we lived with. We took prisoners of war and treated them according to rules, fed them, paid them, gave them medical care. We did this because we'd signed treaties saying we would, because we wanted our own boys treated well when they got captured, because we believed in certain principles about how you fought a war. But we also had men like Bertucci, men who hated, men who wanted revenge. Men who'd been taught that Germans were monsters and couldn't turn off that teaching when the war ended. And sometimes those men had access to guns, had opportunities, had moments where the rules didn't matter because nobody was watching. The question that haunted the investigation, the question that still matters, is whether Bertucci was insane or whether he was just a killer who got caught. The army said insane. Bertucci spent years in institutions, got treatment, was eventually released back into society, lived another 24 years after the shooting. If he was truly insane in 1945, did the treatment cure him, or was he always sane and just got away with murder? Captain Owens thought he was sane, thought the shooting was premeditated. Bertucci told the waitress something exciting would happen. That's planning. He waited until the guard changed. That's patience. He aimed carefully to hit maximum tense. That's execution. None of that sounds like a man who's lost touch with reality. But the doctors disagreed. They had their evaluations, their notes, their professional judgments. And the army went with the doctors. Some historians think the army wanted to avoid a trial, didn't want the publicity. Didn't want to air out how they'd known Bertucci had problems, but kept him in service anyway. Kept assigning him to guard duty despite 12 hospitalizations and multiple psychiatric evaluations. A court-martial would have made all that public, would have raised questions about how the army handled unstable soldiers. Easier to declare him insane, send him away, let the story fade. And it worked. Most people forgot. Salina became a piece of obscure history, something that happened once in a small town and then got buried. But the dead remembered. The graves at Fort Douglas remembered. The wounded who carried their injuries for life remembered. The families who lost sons and husbands and fathers remembered. And some Americans remembered too. Remembered that we did this, that it happened on our soil, that an American soldier murdered prisoners of war and faced no real consequences for it. Salina is a reminder of that failure, a reminder that good intentions don't always translate to good actions, that systems can break down, that rules only work if people follow them. July 8, 1945. 2 months after the war in Europe ended, 250 German prisoners sleeping in tents in Utah, waiting to go home, thinking the worst was over, thinking they'd survived. Then a guard with a grudge and a machine gun changed everything. 15 seconds, 250 rounds, 9 men dead, 20 wounded, the worst massacre at a prisoner of war camp in American history. It shouldn't have happened, could have been prevented. Bertucci had a documented history of mental health issues. Should never have been anywhere near prisoners. Should have been discharged or transferred to a hospital long before July 1945. But he wasn't. He was assigned to guard duty, given access to weapons, put in a position where his hatred could turn into action. And when it did, when he climbed that tower and loaded that gun and started firing, nobody stopped him in time. The system failed, the army failed, the guards failed, and 9 men died because of it. Their names are worth remembering: Otto Bross, Ernst Fuchs, Gottfried Gog, Georg Liske, Hans Meyer, Adolf Paul, Fritz Stockmann, Walter Vogel, Friedrich Ritter. They were soldiers once, fought for Germany in North Africa. Got captured, spent 2 years working on American farms, waiting for the war to end, waiting to go home. They never made it. They're buried in Utah, in a cemetery most of their families never saw, under markers maintained by a country they fought against. That's war. That's what it does. Takes men away from home. Puts them in situations they never chose. Ends their lives in ways nobody predicted. But this wasn't war. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. These men were prisoners, protected by international law. They should have been safe. Should have gone home to whatever was left of their country. Should have had the chance to rebuild their lives. Instead, they died in Utah, shot by a guard who hated them for being German, buried by Americans who'd promised to keep them safe and failed. The story matters because it's true, because it happened, because hiding it or forgetting it doesn't change that. We did this. America did this. Not officially, not as policy, but we created the conditions where it could happen. We kept unstable men in service, gave them weapons, put them in contact with prisoners. And when one of them snapped, when one of them decided to kill, we declared him insane and sent him away rather than hold him accountable. That's the legacy of Salina, not just the massacre, but the cover-up. The decision to avoid prosecution, the choice to let the story fade rather than confront it. The Germans who died at Salina are part of our history. They're buried in American soil. Their graves are marked with American stones. They're our responsibility now, not because we wanted them, but because we took them. Because we promised to keep them safe under the Geneva Convention and then failed. Visiting Fort Douglas Cemetery, you can see their graves, walk among them. Read the names, stand there and think about what it means that they're here. That 9 German soldiers who thought they'd survived the war died in Utah at the hands of an American guard. It's uncomfortable. Should be uncomfortable. Some truths are. Some parts of history don't fit into neat narratives about the good war and the greatest generation and how we did everything right. We didn't do everything right. We did this, and the only honorable thing now is to remember it, to acknowledge it, to make sure people know what happened in Salina on July 8, 1945. The museum helps. The graves help. The stories help. But they only work if people pay attention, if people care enough to learn, to ask questions, to sit with the discomfort of knowing that even in a war we're proud of, even in a cause we believe was just, terrible things happened. 9 men dead, 20 wounded, 1 guard who got away with murder by being declared insane. A town that had to live with what happened in their backyard, a country that buried the story and moved on. That's Salina. That's the Midnight Massacre. That's the worst thing that happened at a prisoner of war camp in American history, and most Americans have never heard of it. Now you have. Now you know. And that matters. Knowing matters. Remembering matters, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. The dead at Fort Douglas deserve that much. The wounded who carried their injuries for life deserve that much. The families who lost sons and fathers and husbands deserve that much. And we deserve it too. Deserve to know our own history, all of it, the good and the bad, the heroic and the shameful. The things we're proud of and the things we need to reckon with. Salina is part of that reckoning, a small part, a forgotten part. But part nonetheless, and it's worth remembering, worth telling, worth passing on to the next generation so they know, so they understand, so they learn from our failures as well as our successes. July 8, 1945, Salina, Utah. 9 German prisoners killed by an American guard. That's the fact. The rest is what we do with it, how we remember, how we teach, how we make sure it never happens again. That's all history really is. Facts and what we do with them. And what we do with Salina, with the Midnight Massacre, says something about who we are, about whether we're willing to face hard truths, about whether we have the courage to look at our past honestly and learn from it. The graves at Fort Douglas are waiting. The museum in Salina is open. The story is there if you want to find it. If you're brave enough to look. If you care enough to remember. If this story surprised you, if it made you think about things you hadn't considered, then give the video a thumbs up. Share it with somebody. Tell your friends. Tell your family. These stories matter. They're part of who we are. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I'm committed to researching deeply, and also telling you what I witnessed during World War II. And if you've got stories of your own, stories about that war or any other time, write them down. Tell them to somebody. Don't let them disappear. History isn't just what's in books. It's what we remember. What we pass along. What we refuse to let die. 9 men, 9 graves, 9 lives ended by hatred and a machine gun on a July night in Utah. Remember them. Remember what happened. Remember why it matters. That's all they have left now. Our memory, our acknowledgement, our willingness to say yes, this happened and it was wrong, and we need to do better. That's what the dead deserve. That's what history demands. That's what we owe to the truth.